Once again, thank you so much for joining us today. Welcome everyone to our parallel event on climate change and the intersection of gender and disability, which is being organized by Women Enabled International and Disability Rights Fund. My name is Sofia Minieri. I am a legal advisor at Women Enabled International, and I would like to welcome you all to this session. We are deeply grateful to the Australian Department of Foreign Affairs and Trade and the Pacific Sub-Regional Office of the United Nations Population Fund for co-sponsoring this event. And before we get started, I wanted to share some housekeeping items. So this event is being live streamed on Facebook, and it is being recorded for them to be shared on our social media accounts. Please note, international sign language interpretation and closed captioning is available. To view the captions, please click on the CC button at the bottom of the Zoom screen in the middle, and then click View Subtitles. Of course, you are completely welcome to share your comments and questions for our speakers using the chat box or the Q&A option feature of Zoom. But if none of these options are accessible to you, please raise your hand and we will ensure that you can participate with your questions and comments. So this is an event on climate change and the intersection of gender and disability. And for around an hour and a half, we are going to discuss how climate change and natural disasters are impacting the lives of women and girls with disabilities in the Pacific region. We will also discuss some lessons learned from recent climate change events and natural disasters in the region in order to know good practices and lessons and things to be improved in terms of ensuring that preparedness efforts and recovery efforts are disability inclusive. And in addition, we will pay particular attention to stressing and discussing the role that people with disabilities and their representative organizations should play in order to ensure that policies and programming around climate change are fully disability inclusive, and the important role that states and other stakeholders should and must play in ensuring and in empowering and strengthening the leadership of women and girls with disabilities to be agents of change in policies and programming around these issues. Now, I would like to introduce our first speaker, the Australian Ambassador for Women and Girls, Christine Clark. Prior to commencing in her current role, Ambassador Clark worked with the Pacific Gender Section in the Department of Foreign Affairs and Trade on reserve service following completion of her lengthy full-time Navy career in June 2021. Ambassador Clark served as Australia's defense advisor and attaché to New Zealand, Cook Islands, and Chile between 2018 and 2021. She has held many senior Navy and Australian Defence Force roles and executive committee positions, including head of the ADF Sexual Misconduct Prevention and Response Office. As a committed LGBTQI+ ally, Ambassador Clark led the Department of Defense contingent in the Sydney Mardi Gras on 2 occasions. She is also a strong advocate for women's rugby and cricket. Ambassador Clark, we are so glad to have you today, and thank you so much for the support of the Australian government as a co-sponsor of this event. Please, the floor is yours.
Thank you, Sophia, for such a warm welcome. I would like to begin by acknowledging the Ngunnawal people as the traditional custodians of the land from which I am joining you today, and pay my respects to their elders past, present, and emerging. In Ngunnawal language, Dawara Nuna, Dawara Ngunnawal, Yangu, Nalawiri, Dunamanyin, Ngunnawal wari, Duwarawari, Ningara Dindi, Wungarali Jinyin. From Ngunnawal and other lands, we are all experiencing and responding to climate change, and many of us are preparing for and managing natural disasters, facing complex and interconnected systemic challenges, grappling with the health, economic, and social shocks of COVID-19 on top of conflict-related crises. We know that our Pacific family are faced with disaster and climate change-related threats. There are the threats to lives and livelihoods with the loss of both. Even just from an economic standpoint, in the Pacific, economic damage from disasters cost 7% of the GDP, and that was prior to the COVID-19 pandemic. And this is not for the Pacific alone, it is for all of us. As I speak to you, Australia is recovering from devastating floods. In light of this, I would like to acknowledge all of the incredible women leaders in the Pacific, particularly those being heard through programs such as Australia's Pacific Women Lead program, supporting Pacific-led approaches and prioritising Pacific agency to promote leadership, rights, and equality in sectors including climate and disaster resilience. I would also like to acknowledge all the incredible leaders from organisations for people with disabilities. I was pleased to attend the Pacific Satellite Summit on Disability that Australia was proud to co-host, taking place ahead of the Global Disability Summit earlier this month. At the Pacific Summit, we heard from many committed, dedicated, and insightful leaders of diverse genders on how to strengthen Pacific-led initiatives to ensure they are inclusive for all. We know disasters and climate change exacerbate existing inequalities. Women, people with disability, and other at-risk communities are disproportionately affected by disasters and have different and uneven levels of resources and access to services to recover. Australia has a long-standing commitment to supporting the human rights of women and girls with disabilities, including those affected by climate change in the Pacific region, and we would like to recognise our valuable partners for their efforts, leading the charge on climate change, adaptation, mitigation, and response. Thank you for all you do. Past experiences have taught us time and time again that the consequences of climate change are often more severe for people with disabilities than the general population, and even more so for women with disabilities. Many are at risk of neglect, abandonment, and even death during instances of migration or disasters due to physical, communication, and other social and environmental barriers, as well as disrupted supported networks. People with disabilities are, at times, in situations of social, economic, and political disadvantage and can have less access to services and support. During humanitarian crises, children with disabilities are at a higher risk of abuse and neglect, and women with disabilities are at higher risk of sexual and gender-based violence. We also know that disasters and climate change heighten the risk of sexual and gender-based violence, particularly for women and girls with a disability, and that comprehensive essential services must be made available to survivors of violence, such as access to sexual and reproductive health care, as well as mental health and psychosocial and livelihood support. Research conducted in Vanuatu after Tropical Cyclone Pam in 2015 found that 60% of people with disabilities reported a lack of emergency and preparedness information. The injury rate among people with disabilities was 2.45 times higher than those without disabilities. When we overlay other forms of identity, like gender and age, the statistics are even more concerning. 74% of women with disabilities reported barriers to accessing evacuation centres compared to 50% of men with disabilities. However, sometimes just how disproportionate the impacts of disasters and climate change are for women and girls are not documented. A 2019 UN Women and UNICEF review found huge gaps in disaggregated quantitative data at a global level. With a near total absence of sex and age disaggregated impact data in global disaster databases and in global analysis of differential impact. A review of the Disenfanta database revealed that only 11 out of 85 countries disaggregated data by sex for mortality. And out of those 11, only 0.65% of recorded deaths were disaggregated by disability. When minority and marginalised groups such as women and girls with a disability are largely invisible in mainstream data, and there is limited consideration of the ways in which multiple intersecting areas of risk and inequality interact, discrimination and disadvantage are perpetuated. We know that the impacts of disaster and climate change on people are influenced by social norms, including those that give rise to discrimination based on gender, class, ethnicity, age, and disability. In light of this, Australia's Climate Change Action Strategy 2020-2025 promotes social inclusion and gender equality with a clear focus on at-risk groups and communities, including women and girls, gender diverse people, people with disabilities, and Indigenous peoples. Gender equality is a priority and cross-cutting issue for Australia's development program, as outlined in our Partnerships for Recovery, Australia's COVID-19 development response. The Paris Agreement acknowledged gender equality and empowerment of women in its preamble, including specific references to gender responsive adaptation action in Article 7 and gender responsive capacity building in Article 9. I'm proud to say that Australia is partnering with the United Nations Office for Disaster Risk Reduction to host the Asia Pacific Ministerial Conference on Disaster Risk Reduction in Brisbane in September this year, at which gender equality and disability inclusion are cross-cutting themes. Solutions and challenges will be shared, including those identified through the national reviews planned for 2022 to inform the midterm review of the Sendai framework. It is essential that people with a disability, and especially women and girls with a disability, are actively included in disaster preparedness and response efforts at global, regional, and national levels. I'm inspired that in July 2019, Australia co-sponsored the first United Nations Human Rights Council resolution on climate change and the rights of people with disabilities, which called on governments to adopt a disability inclusive approach. Supporting climate change to gender responsive and inclusive of people with a disability will make mitigation, adaptation, and resilience efforts more effective and sustainable and lead to more equitable long-term outcomes. As we cannot deny the challenges women and girls with disability face when affected by climate change, we must identify the opportunities we have to advance gender equality and disability inclusion together. Not about us, without us is a matter of action. Thank you for your leadership in convening this important conversation at the Commission on the Status of Women. This side event is an important opportunity to discuss the impacts of climate change and natural disasters on the lives and human rights of women and girls with disabilities in the Pacific region. I hope that the rest of your discussion is a productive and inspiring one. Australia will continue to work with you all, being a strong advocate for women and girls with disabilities and for our region. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Ambassador Clark, for joining us today and for the commitment to work around these issues. It's time now for us, or for me, to present the next speakers, Annapella Talakai and Naomi Tai. Annapella is a recognized disability advocate and leader in the Tonga disability community. She is currently a board member of Lavamea Taieloa Disabled People Association, LATA, a local organization of persons with disabilities with approximately 200 members, including persons with disabilities from the outer islands. Annapella leads the latest Women's Committee, and it's the leads disability and disaster resource team member of the National Disability Task Force. Annapella has also held board roles with now Alamataya Tonga Association and National Cross Disability OPD, and with the Pacific Disability Forum, the regional peak body of OPDs. She has been instrumental in advocating for the rights of women with disabilities in Tonga, and has participated in research led by Pacific Disability Forum on the barriers experienced by women with disabilities in the Pacific. Naomi Tai is an exceptional young leader with a disability from the Solomon Islands. She is the Disaster Risk Reduction Officer at People with Disabilities Solomon Island, an organization of persons with disabilities, and serves as a member of the Australia Humanitarian Program Coordination Committee and the Protection Committee. As part of her role, she supports Australian humanitarian partnership lead agencies to ensure disability inclusion across all their activities and programs. She is also a youth committee member with the People with Disabilities Solomon Island, works as a volunteer officer to the organization's board, and is in charge of liaising with the wider disability community in Honiara. Naomi also leads awareness raising programs in schools, a radio program, and conducts awareness raising activities in the rural provinces. Another of our speakers is Nelly Kalev, who is joining us from Vanuatu. She is a prominent advocate for the rights of persons with disabilities in Vanuatu. She is the national coordinator of the Vanuatu Disability Promotion and Advocacy Association, and a prominent member of the Vanuatu Civil Society Disability Network. She serves at the steering committee of the Shifting the Power Coalition and the Task Force on Climate Change and Disaster Preparedness and Response. She has also served as a co-chair of the Pacific Disability Forum and a board member of the International Disability Alliance. In 2020, she participated in the Vanuatu National General Election as an independent candidate, representing women, people with disabilities, and other marginalized groups. Due to her contribution in empowering other Indigenous women and Indigenous women with disabilities, she has received several awards, including a recognition as a woman political leader in Vanuatu, and the 2015 Andy Lynch Award in recognition of her outstanding contribution to disability promotion and advocacy. So thank you to our speakers for joining us today. And the first question that we wanted to share with them is for them to introduce themselves and their organizations, and to please tell us about how natural disasters are impacting the rights of women and girls with disabilities in your country, and the work your organization is doing to advance the rights of women and girls with disabilities in the context of climate change and natural disasters. I will invite Annapella to go first. Annapella, the floor is yours. Anna, can you hear us? She's unmuted. Okay, so let's go with our second speaker, and then we go back to you, Anna, or we are going to, show the video we have. Naomi, can you hear us? If so, the floor is yours.
Yes. Good morning from Solomon Islands. My name is Naomi Tai. I'm from the Solomon Islands. I acquired my disability from birth. I work with the Organization of People with Disabilities Solomon Islands as the DRR officer. I work with the organization, and the core mandate of this organization is to advocate for the rights of persons with disabilities, to ensure their voices are heard, and to protect, promote, and advance their human rights at all levels of societies. People with disabilities on islands is the recognition, coordination point between governments, other stakeholders, both national and international, through expertise, advices, collaboration, consultation, and engagement with people with disabilities on the islands. I would like to acknowledge the co-organizers for this event, Women Enable International, and the DRF, Disability Rights Fund. Acknowledge also the sponsors for this event, Australian Department of Foreign Affairs, Trade, DFAT, United Nations Population Fund, Pacific Disability Regional Office, UNFPA, giving this space for us as a young women with disabilities in the Pacific to raise our voices in this platform. Thank you. Think for us back in my country, speaking on my experience, when it comes to the rights of women with disabilities, we often left out in areas, a lot of areas. When it comes to decision makings and planning, women and girls with disabilities are less heard or definitely left out. I have been engaged in some of the activities that carry out from our partners in our communities, like here in home. I've observed that most of men carry out the disaster response, even present during meetings, addressing disaster plannings and decision making when it comes to emergency response. Perhaps it affects us, our access to information and essential services, as there is no mechanism set up in place to address how we've accessed those informations and services during natural disasters. During natural disasters, families and communities, we tend to face a lot of challenges. Thus, the pressure may add to girls and women with disability not properly taken off. We access our rights to access safe and friendly environment during natural disasters are often not addressed. For example, evacuation centers during natural disasters that happen were not set up to cater for the needs of people with disability in general. Most women and girls with disabilities tend to face abuses during natural disaster times. Perhaps in the context of the Solomon Island in terms of climate change, with the work that we have done with other partners in the country, the Solomon Islands has been at the forefront of the climate change adoption research, including a recent research piece by the Pacific Disability Forum, PDF, in the late 2020, early 2021. The purpose and the target of this research try to identify the impacts of the climate change to how it directly affects the lives of people with disabilities. People with disabilities Solomon Islands, also we work closely with the Oxfam Solomon Islands to improve community resilience through awareness sessions on climate change. We've worked close with MET, the office in Solomon Islands, and also the National Disaster Office on how to give early warning messaging for people with disabilities in the country to ensure information is made accessible. We have the climate change officer, Dex, who is based here in our country office in Honiara, who work on to identify the challenges faced by the people with disabilities regarding climate change and advocate on how we can address the needs of people with disabilities regarding the climate change. People with disabilities Solomon Islands, we also work closely to provide our stakeholders with information regarding the challenges of people with disabilities in terms of climate change and natural disaster. We also lobby for the policies and response plans to be more inclusive. I would like to remind the stage as the key messages that I would like to put across here, this platform. At this time, it is important for all humanitarian actors to coordinate and work closely with the organizations of people with disabilities to identify and address factors that make it difficult for us, our women and girls with disability, to access assistance, as well as factors that promote their inclusion and protection in the Solomon Islands. Some of our programs that we have been engaged with other partners, PWDSI continues engaged with the AHP agencies on Disaster Ready program, the National Protection Committee, and the other local and national government sectors in the country. People with disability must be included and prioritized. NGOs must be in touch with the people with disabilities. We understand that the needs of women with disabilities are able to provide advices and support on how programs can be disability inclusive during times of disaster. Without the OBDs, the Organization of People with Disabilities, there is no access to humanitarian assistance for persons with disability, especially women, and we will be left out continuously. We cannot do this alone. It is important to remind the states again that women and girls with disabilities are an important part of our societies and one of the most vulnerable groups. Involve us in disaster response planning so that we can include our inputs and how we can go about meeting our needs in disaster times. Consult us on the issues that we are facing as women with disabilities regarding accessibilities, in order that we will have the most up-to-date disability inclusive advices to be implemented in disaster risk reduction policies and plans. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Naomi. I don't know if my colleague Nelly is in the room and can hear us. If so, Nelly, we wanted to invite you. Good morning, Nelly. We wanted to invite you to tell us a bit more about the important work your organization does around the rights of women and girls with disabilities in Vanuatu in the context of climate change and natural disasters, and how women and girls with disabilities are being impacted by natural disasters in Vanuatu. The floor is yours.
Thank you, Sophia. I won't be using my camera because there's problem on connection of internet. Good morning and good afternoon, colleagues. My name is Nelly Caleb. I'm the National Coordinator for the Vanuatu Disability Promotion and Advocacy Association, VDPA for short. VDPA is the only national organization of persons with disabilities in Vanuatu. It has 32 local DBOs, or local organization of persons with disabilities, in 6 provinces across Vanuatu, with a mandate to advocate for rights and promote abilities for people with disabilities. VDPA was established on 4 April 1999 and was formally registered as charitable organization with the Financial Services Commission in 2002. Our purpose: we are an organization for the voice of people with disabilities in Vanuatu, and we aspire to ensure that all our efforts and interventions is for an accessible and inclusive Vanuatu for all persons with disabilities. And we do this in partnership with that organization. I would like to share with you our experiences in the Category 5 Tropical Cyclone Harold, which hit the northern part of Vanuatu on the 6th and 7th April 2020. Yet before any disaster or in the current situation during peace times, women and girls with disabilities are already at risk and marginalized because services are not accessible. The environment is not accessible. Stigma still exists in some of our society. And in the case of disaster or humanitarian emergency, we will already at risk because, we will already be at risk before, even more during and after. People with disabilities are often considered in humanitarian contexts as receivers of support rather than key actors. For instance, officers did not see the importance to include us in disaster response, that they have other excuses. In the wake of TC Harold, most of us have not experienced a Category 5 cyclone. The damage was so devastating. Members' homes either damaged or destroyed. Post-disaster, while we pick up the pieces and rebuild our lives, it is always a struggle because our food source is destroyed, water source contaminated, our homes damaged or destroyed. And then we have to manage another layer of struggle. If our assistive device is damaged or destroyed during disaster, our support persons are not available or very limited because everybody else is trying to recover and build their lives. I give you an example of the volcano asphalt in Ambai. When the villages with disabilities evacuated to Santo, they were told to get into the plane and leave everything behind. It was an emergency. People, and particularly women with disabilities, had to live without their assistive device and even their personal assistants. Some women with disabilities have been chased from their family. I'd like to share with you an experience of a woman with disabilities, member of Little People. Her home was totally destroyed by TC Harold. She evacuated to her brother's home, and her sister-in-law continued to chase her a couple of times. She came to the office with tears and shared her experience, complained at the office. So VDP advocate to other partners, and finally, one of them built a new home for her. Since 2016, Pacific Disability Forum, as well as VDP and Fiji Disabled People's Federation, have been founding members of the Shifting the Power Coalition, working together to drive a transformative change for greater accountability in our collective rights, to lead in disaster management and climate actions. As a gender and disability focal point of the coalition, I have been able to contribute enhancing the integration of disability rights and inclusion in all aspects of our of our collective work, which is seeing the greater participation of women with disabilities involved in local-led training programs, not just as participants in the room, but in supporting cross-coalition learning to ensure we as women with disability are seen and heard in the national and regional forums. It is how we amplify our collective call to leave no woman with disabilities behind. 2, This was further evident in April 2020 when, together with Action Aid Vanuatu and Vanuatu Young Women for Change, we led the first New Vanuatu Women's Response at DC Harold. We were able to gather to use the documented evidence of the impact of DC Harold on women in our VTPA network to drive response that was inclusive and accountable to women with disabilities. Collectively, we call for a protection with dignity approach that took into account the personal loss and trauma that worsens during environmental crisis, including cyclones and floods. If our governments are committed to leaving no one behind, then information and communication must be accessible at all times and taking into account all people with disabilities. In conclusion, as we have been saying since 2016, it is time to shift the power, including resources where we are organizing at the local level and to support our capacity needs as well. Through the Shifting the Power Coalition, women with disabilities partners are able to access rapid response grants to support our own emergency response. And a new Power Shift Fund established with the Asia Foundation provides us with resources for our core needs. That is how we are able to work with and in our communities, as well as have the time and resource to be in the national or provincial decision-making table. So build on our efforts, including with the financial investments in our network coalition to enable us, Pacific women with disabilities, to bring our traditional and indigenous knowledge, innovations to tackle the climate crisis. To have the resources to invest in our generation of young women leaders in our disability movement. Let's shift the power together and leave no one behind. Thank you, Tomas.
Thank you so much, Nelly, especially for stressing the need to include people with disabilities in policies and programming around climate change, and a focus also on the importance of financing and ensuring that people with disabilities and their organizations have enough resources for this really critical work. We are going to go back to that point in a few minutes. Now it's time for us to share two short presentations from the last speaker, Annapela Talakai. Annapela is here with us, but she's facing some technical issues with internet. That's also an important thing to consider when we are thinking of advocacy in a virtual world, that not everyone has a really good connection, and that's something that has to be taken care of and should be taken into account when we all conduct advocacy around these issues. So we are going to share two videos from Annapela. During the first video, in her first intervention, she is going to tell us more about the work of her organization around the rights of women and girls with disabilities in the context of climate change and natural disasters, and the work her organization is doing to address these issues. So one of my colleagues is going to share the video in a second.
Hi everyone, and Malalele to you all. My name is Anna, and I'm representative from the Lavameta Ilo Disabled People Association, which is known LATA or LATA. LATA is a self-advocacy group, and our role is to lobby and advocate for the right of a person with disability in Tonga. Not only that, we are currently doing an awareness program to the climate change and natural disaster in the community, and also we do a capacity building just to strengthening the capacity of our members. And so So we work very closely with the National Emergency Management Office and also the Climate Change Division, and lobby to develop the National Disability Inclusive Policy for the natural disaster and the climate change also. But anyways, coming up to myself, I'm a disaster resource team leader, and as well as a member of disaster steering committee of the organizations for persons with disability in Tonga. And not only that, I help the organization to conduct the training and the awareness raising throughout the community. But while I was working with the organizations, we realized that the impact or a right of women and girls with disability before, during, and after the natural disaster, it's a real challenge, because we know that we are not included in a national emergency management plan of the government there, but it's really important for the government to realize that the full and effective participants of women and girls with disability in planning and decision making, to make sure that the safety and the protections of themselves in natural disaster, and also to prioritize their needs. And the other things about the facility and the informations, I know those two things, it's a big challenge, because they are not accessible to accommodate the need of women and girls with disability during the disaster. And also the lack of consultation between the government and the service provider, and also the disability organizations, just to make sure that they truly understand how to catering a women and girl with disability before and during the natural disaster. I think this is some of the things that it's really affect the rights of a women and girl with disability in natural disaster.
Resume button. In the center at the top of the screen.
When the volcanic eruption and the tsunami happened, I was so afraid, because like you all know, I'm totally blind, and I used to staying with other two blind girls, my 80 years old mother who cannot walk, and also my three kids. My eldest son, he was 13, and the second one, he was 3 years old, and my youngest daughter, she was 11 months on that time. Apart from that, my house was beside the coastal water, but during the disaster, honestly, I don't even know what am I gonna do, how I evacuate them all to the hill, because my husband was not at home on that time, and also we had no vehicle.
Resume button.
And plus we have no vehicles, and not only that, there is no support services to rely on. So I thought to myself, if I cannot do something, we all die. At the same time, honestly, even though I was afraid, but I tried to, I don't want my son to know that I'm afraid. So I asked him to lead us to the hill. So we all ran on the road, and on our way to the hill, I got a phone call. It's my mom. She just called up and she crying. She say, "Why are you guys going and leave me here? I will die." On that time, I thought to myself, I have to take my children and those two to the hill, so I have to come back and rescue her. Um, so I do. When we reach to the hill, I leave my children and those two girls. So I go back with my son to rescue my mom. But luckily, on our way home, we met a man on his vehicle, so we asked his help, and so we went and picked up my mom from home and take it to the hills. So I forever grateful we all alive. But um, the experience that I'm facing in this disaster about the early warning system, apart from the announcing the radio, there's no siren sound to let us know there is a volcanic eruption and tsunami coming. And there is no plan at all. But at the same time, I need to improve that just to make sure that there is a inclusive preparedness and recovery effort planned to implement after the disaster. And but at the same time, my advice for the stakeholders and all the listening, just to make sure that disability is a cross-cutting issue as well as human right. We have to treat a person with disability on an equal basis with others. Malo.
Resume button.
Thank you, Anna, for sharing your words with us. Again, she's in the room, so please feel free to share any questions you might have for her in the chat box or in the Q&A box. And in addition, if none of these options is accessible, please note that there is a raise your hand button at the bottom of your screen that you can use to raise your hand, and we will allow you to participate. Thank you to all our speakers, Anna, Nelly, and Naomi, for sharing such important ideas about the impact that climate change and natural disasters are having on the rights of women and girls with disabilities, and the essential important steps that states and other stakeholders should take to ensure that policies and programming around climate change and natural disasters are fully disability inclusive. So before opening the floor to questions from the public, again, use the chat, use the Q&A, or raise your hand. I wanted to share very few ideas around the obligations of states around or in relation to addressing the needs of persons with disabilities and women and girls with disabilities in particular in the context of climate change. So I will share my screen. I hope you can see the full screen. Okay, this will be just, a very brief summary of the state's obligations on the right of women and girls with disabilities in the context of climate change and natural disasters. But before that, I wanted to share some very key ideas about our work, the work that we at WI, Women Enabled International, are doing in the Pacific, along with the Pacific Disability Forum and other OPDs from the region. So as part of the transformative agenda for women, adolescents, and youth in the Pacific, the United Nations Population Fund, in particular the Pacific Sub-Regional Office, WEI and PDF, we are working together to identify and promote the eradication of the barriers affecting access to sexual and reproductive health and rights and GBV services for women and young people with disabilities living in the Pacific region. And a key strategy that we have implemented to do so is to conduct needs assessments of the needs and the barriers impacting sexual and reproductive health and rights for women and girls with disabilities. And in addition, their right to be free from gender-based violence. And some of this research has highlighted the impact that climate change is having on the rights of women and girls with disabilities. This work is being supported by DFAT, by the Australian government, and our needs assessment reports are going to be published in the upcoming weeks. So, as I mentioned, I wanted to share very brief ideas around the obligations of states in relation to the rights of women and girls with disabilities in the context of climate change and natural disasters. And a key article around this issue, a key legal provision around these issues is Article 11 of the Convention on the Rights of Persons with Disabilities, which, as the Office of the United Nations High Commissioner for Human Rights has stressed, is key to ensuring that climate change programs and policies, as well as prevention, planning, and response, are fully inclusive of persons with disabilities. But please don't think that Article 11 is the only provision of the CRPD or the only provision of a human rights treaty that applies to the right of women and girls with disabilities in the context of climate change. All the provisions of the CRPD, including those related to accessibility, including those related to the right to be free from violence, and the right to, including those provisions related to the right to health, are fully applicable to women and girls with disabilities in the context of climate change, in addition to the provisions included in other human rights treaties, such as the CEDAW Convention. Under international human rights law, under these human rights treaties, including the CRPD, states have an obligation to apply a twin-track approach into policies and programs around climate change. And this means that states must mainstream a disability inclusion approach into all its actions around these issues. And in addition, it might be necessary for states to develop targeted actions to address specific needs that women and girls with disabilities might have in the context of climate change and natural disasters. But it is impossible to develop a policy or a program around climate change without the meaningful participation of persons with disabilities and their diverse representative organization. And this is something that our speakers have stressed today. And to that end, as already mentioned by our speakers, it is essential for states and other stakeholders to invest in increased capacity and empowerment of people with disabilities. In addition, it is impossible for states and even for other stakeholders to develop any action around these issues without disaggregated disability data and around climate change and their impact of women and girls. There are really important initiatives from civil society organizations and OPDs around these issues, but states already still have so many pending challenges in terms of collecting the segregated data around these issues. And in addition, it is essential for states to develop inclusive and accessible emergency information, education, infrastructures, and services, and also to raise awareness among key stakeholders about the rights of women and girls with disabilities in the context of climate change and natural disasters, especially aid workers. But in addition, it is essential to engage in more in broader raise awareness actions in order to address the stereotypes and stigma that is present in many societies in the Pacific region and around the globe about people with disabilities, because this stigma and discrimination and stereotypes are having a real impact in society's response to climate change and natural disasters. And finally, it is essential for states to honor the principle building back better and to incorporate and honor the principle of universal design that requires states to develop programs, infrastructures, services in a way that is accessible to all the people to the greatest extent without the need to make any kind of accommodation. So the building back better principle and the universal design principle, that is a key principle within the CRPD Convention, should guide the state's actions, especially those related to recovery efforts. So that's all on my end, but I want to stress one thing that all participants, different participants have stressed, that is related to the importance of ensuring that people with disabilities and their organizations have sufficient funding to advocate for the rights of people with disabilities in the context of climate change and natural disasters. And so now I would like to give the floor to my colleague, Jen Bokov, who is going to address the importance of ensuring enough resources for women and girls with disabilities and their representative organizations in the context of climate change and natural disasters. Jen, the floor is yours.
Thanks, Sophia, and thanks to all the presenters so far. I've been learning a lot and just so appreciate you all being here today. So my name is Jen. I'm the Director of Development for the Disability Rights Fund and our sister organization, the Disability Rights Advocacy Fund. And we are among the only grant makers dedicated solely to funding OPDs in the Global South. So to date, we've moved more than $40 million US to more than 400 OPDs across 39 countries, including many in the Pacific. And we're the largest supporter of women with disabilities, and in many cases, the first and only funder of their representative organizations. Our grant making continues to expand in size and diversity, increasingly reaching Pacific women and LGBTQI persons with disabilities, which is in alignment with our gender guidelines. We've made our funding really flexible to sustain activists with disabilities and their advocacy, especially during climate-related disasters and other crises. So for example, more than 80% of our grants were redirected to address critical gaps in resources and new advocacy opportunities that were created by COVID-19. This approach is core to our work, and we're currently supporting grantees in Tonga to repurpose funds to support acute needs after the eruption, and now in response to the recent surge in COVID. The work of our grantees, including the organizations represented on today's panel, demonstrates again and again that women with disabilities are essential leaders in efforts to ensure inclusive responses to crises. These women are leading advocacy to increase access to basic needs, to safety, to justice, and to information. They're developing inclusive disaster mitigation plans and budgets at national and grassroots level, including for accessible early warning systems that have been so essential in so many emergencies. And they're constantly working to ensure that women with disabilities are included and centered in decision-making processes, programs, and policies that are related to emergency response and climate change mitigation in their communities. But of course, this fight for rights comes in the face of stark realities. We know that women with disabilities, who are 1 in 5 of all women, are acutely impacted by crises, including climate change, and 3 to 4 times more likely to experience gender-based violence than women without disabilities. Still, only 1% of human rights funding for women and girls or for Indigenous persons reference persons with disabilities. And overall, grants for persons with disabilities constitute only 2% of all human rights funding. This is really troubling, especially because it's the only population group for which global human rights funding is declining based on the latest data released by Candid and the Human Rights Funders Network a couple of months ago. While intersectionality is a buzzword in the philanthropy sector, the data show that it is very slow to manifest in donor strategies and portfolios. The philanthropy sector tends to value expertise before action. And we believe that this fear of not getting it right is one of the reasons that's keeping funders from investing in disability rights. And I'm here to tell you that this perfectionism is the enemy of better. It gets in the way. We have to get past this idea that we have to be perfect before we do something at all. And further, the expertise that donors seek, it exists. And you know what? You saw it today from our amazing panelists. The sector just needs to listen to it. So for those of you interested in making your institutions and grant-making practices more disability inclusive and gender responsive, I want to offer you a couple of concrete steps. First, and most importantly, provide funding. Seriously, fund. Fund the efforts of women with disabilities to claim their rights and do it flexibly. They are already in the areas where you work. See them, accompany them, and resource them. Second, incorporate efforts to shift the power in every aspect of your work. Hiring and promoting persons with disabilities, simplifying grant applications, and adopting participatory grant-making practices are all examples of ways to move power to marginalized communities. 3, actively engage in conversations to combat ableism and sexism within your organization. You can do this from wherever you sit in your organization. You do not need to be the leader to be able to do this. So one starting place for accountability is to sign up for the Disability and Philanthropy Forum's Disability Inclusion Pledge. And Faith, who's been awesome at putting links in the chat, is going to put an article in the chat that links you to that pledge and to a bunch of other tips. And finally, all of the speakers and partners on this event are really happy and eager to share further ideas. We could talk all day about this. So you don't have to create solutions on your own. Please, please, please reach out to us. So we'll all put some links and email addresses in the chat and take note of them and reach out to us. So in closing, before we go to Q&A, I just want to underscore that I hope it's really clear from today's panel that resourcing women with disabilities isn't a nice to do, it's a must do. So I'll leave you with the words of Swanette Desir, who's the founder of a women-led grantee in Haiti. Quote, We want women with disabilities to carry their own voices. That's why women with disabilities have to be at the center of the cause as stakeholders and spokespersons for their demands. The respect for our rights will not be possible without the solidarity and collaboration of all. All right, back to you, Sophia, to lead us through Q&A.
Thank you so much, Jen. I will remove this spoiler. Okay, so first of all, feel free to share your questions and comments in the chat box or in the Q&A chat, Q&A box. We already have some questions for our speakers, so the first question is for Nelly. As she mentioned, leadership and the next generation, but also open to others. Based on your experience, what role can or should founders play in supporting or strengthening the leadership development of young women with disabilities? What role can or should founders play in supporting or strengthening the leadership development of young women with disabilities? Nelly, are you still with us? If so, the floor is yours.
Thank you, Sophia. The role that funders should play is to walk through our regional body, which is the Pacific Disability Forum, to liaise with us, because that's when we have this regional body. So it's to make sure, go through the Pacific Disability Forum, and then if they're wanting to fund some of our organizations in the Pacific, they need to go through the Pacific Disability Forum. And also with the Shifting the Power Coalition, which I've mentioned earlier about the Pacific Disability Forum and Fiji Disabled People's Organization being founder of this organization or this network, they can go through them as well, so that they can fund our organization. I hope I'm answering the right question.
Thank you so much, Nelly. We have another message. So thank you, Anna, Naomi, and Nelly, for sharing these really important perspectives. To what degree do you all, as women with disabilities, feel integrated into the broader women's or feminist movement related to climate change in the Pacific? Are there barriers you've seen to participation or good experiences you can share? And we have another comment from someone in the audience. Are there any programs for support to the vulnerable women with hepatitis B? That would be for all the speakers. So Anna, Naomi, and Nelly, feel free to unmute yourself.
For me, Nelly in Vanuatu, you will talk about barriers in Vanuatu, as I've mentioned in my speech. The lack of sign language. Like when we talk about women with disabilities, we have different diverse women with disabilities. So this lack of sign language, and our members who are deaf are always left out. For example, in any information that comes out from the TV, or even in the community, communicating with a woman with a disability or with who is deaf, it's really hard because there's no national sign language in Vanuatu. And even those who are blind, it's really hard for them to read the text messages of the early warning system. And most of our women, we did a start in 2015 after the tropical cyclone Pam, which is category 5 that hits Vanuatu. And we did a study and we found out that 62% of women with disabilities are illiterate. They did not go to school. I felt that because of the many barriers that they face in the society. And maybe it's because of their parents or because of the community, the attitudinal barriers. And the stigma stays a long time till today, and it's really hard for them to participate. But with this current time, women with disabilities are really speaking out, which is really good. We had a national convening workshop last year, which Action with Vanuatu has sponsored. And you can see these women coming up to speak up and asking questions to the national authority. Where is our seat? Where is disability inclusion? So I'm so happy that these young women are coming up, but we need more women. And I'm saying this because these women are living in the city, like Portville and Luganville. But we need to empower some other women in the rural settings. They need to speak up so that the twin track approach can be achieved. In the rural areas, there's still lack of understanding. They still don't have the confidence. But it's good to have more trainings, more programs like the National Convening Workshop to empower them to come up to say their own words and not waiting for someone to speak on their behalf. VDP is a self-help organization, I would say that, and we have to fundraise for our activity, and it's really hard. Vanuatu's one of the barriers in Vanuatu is the geographical locations. It's too expensive to reach one island to the other island. And not only Vanuatu, but in the other Pacific countries as well. Geographical location is so costly. Thank you so much, Sophia.
Thank you, Nelly. I am so sorry we are running out of time, but I wanted to share one final question, in this case for Naomi. Can you please share with us some examples of the effective practices and not so effective practices working with partners on issues related to disasters?
Thank you. Thank you, Sophia. I think with my experience on the ground working with the partners as a young women with disability, I know that there are some of the effective work that the partners have been doing throughout the years. The year that the AHP program began in 2019, and there is a progress of the disability inclusion in the programs and activities that the partners has been rolled out in the communities. Perhaps it still need a lot of work around that, because you know that most of the partners in terms of disability inclusion, they need to get more information, and especially the trainings on disability inclusions, and they need to come down to us, the DPOs in our own organization. We need to sit around the tables and discuss together on what issues that we want to put across with our partners to be more effective. As we said, that we need more effective of disability inclusion in their programs and the participation of people with disabilities, not to as we said, not to just get our patients with disabilities on the programs, but to build their capacities and empower them to be raise their voices and confident that space to be for them to speak on. So I know that perhaps it's challenging for us here in the country as well. As a person that I work with across the partners, I try to work with them to see the participation and the engagement of people with disabilities, women and girls with disability, to be more adept in the programs to confident and the space for the people with disability to be shared in the space.
Thank you so much, Anna, Nelly, and Naomi, for sharing such valuable information and for sharing your experiences and the experiences of your organizations in advocating for the rights of women and girls with disabilities in the context of climate change. And in addition, for sharing your ideas and perspectives around the important work different stakeholders and important role different stakeholders can play in developing programming and policies around climate change and natural disasters that are fully inclusive of women and girls with disabilities. Now it's time for me to introduce our last speaker, Kathleen Taylor, the International Program Coordinator of the Pacific Sub-Regional Office of the United Nations Population Fund, who is going to share some closing remarks with us. Kathy is the International Program Coordinator and the UNFPA Pacific Sub-Regional Office. She leads the Transformative Agenda program, which aims to end unmet need for family planning across 6 Pacific countries, which includes a focus on mainstreaming disability inclusion and is founded by the Government of Australia. She has more than 20 years of experience working on SHR, sexual and reproductive health and rights, gender equality, and violence prevention and response program. Kathy, the floor is yours.
Great, thank you, Sophia, and thank you so much, everyone. This has been such a wonderful and informative panel. I myself continue to learn and grow. So just thank you so much, everyone, for being here today. I realize we're a little bit short on time, so I'm going to say some of my remarks and shorten some, because also I feel that a lot of really interesting things have already been said. As we know, climate change is expected to increase pressure on health systems and cause major disruption in access to services, particularly sexual and reproductive health services and commodities, and services on gender-based violence. Also, climate change is a major threat to the vision of a human-centered sustainable development. UNFPA is committed to supporting the implementation of the International Conference on Population and Development, the Program of Action, to support the realization of sexual and reproductive health and rights of all people. In order to do so, UNFPA is committed to 3 transformative results by the end of 2030: ending preventable maternal mortality, ending unmet need for family planning, and ending gender-based violence and harmful practices. As we know, there are a lot of impacts from climate change on sexual and reproductive health and gender-based violence. For example, heat worsens maternal and neonatal health outcomes. Climate-related emergencies cause major disruptions in access to health services and life-saving commodities. And as we've already mentioned, climate change increases the risk of violence against women, child and early forced marriages, as well as trafficking, as well as puts at risk access to GBV services. Particularly here in the Pacific, over 1.7 million people in the Pacific live with a disability, so that's over 15% of the population. And as we've already mentioned, people with disabilities have disproportionately negative experiences in disasters and other conflicts and displacement. We've already mentioned today about the Convention on the Rights of Persons with Disability and that how it calls on for all necessary measures to ensure the protection and safety of persons with disabilities in situations of risk, as well as Article 25, which recognizes that persons with disabilities have the right to the enjoyment of the highest attainable standard of health, including sexual and reproductive health and discrimination without basis on disability. UNFPA is committed to addressing the needs of people with disabilities in its programming, as outlined in our new strategic plan from 2022 to 2025, as well as a new disability strategy for the same period. It's important to apply a nexus approach that looks at both development and humanitarian programming in order to reduce the impact of cyclical or recurrent climate-related shocks and stresses that will focus on work needed to coherently address people's vulnerability before, during, and after crises. And organizations and people with disabilities are a fundamental part of this. Sophia briefly mentioned the Transformative Agenda program and that we've been working with Women Enabled International, Pacific Disability Fund, as well as with local disabled people's organizations. And she mentioned that we have done done an assessment on the needs of people living with disabilities in terms of sexual and reproductive health and gender-based violence. So we have also done an assessment of health facility readiness in terms of sexual and reproductive health and gender-based violence. And I want to share just a little bit of data with you, particularly about access for people with disabilities in the Pacific to these services. So the health facilities were assessed on physical accessibility, information and communication barriers, and only 4% of facilities in Kiribati, 28% of facilities in Fiji, and 65% of facilities in Tonga are currently accessible to persons with a physical disability. In regards to communication barriers, Samoa and Tonga have no sign language interpretation, and IEC materials in Braille available in any health facilities. In Fiji, 1%, and in Kiribati, 2% of the health facilities have sign language interpretation available. So thus, key recommendations from the health facility readiness assessment is to expand services for people with disabilities and to ensure that all facilities are accessible to people with disabilities, and for the ministries of health to develop and distribute IEC materials that are disability friendly. As I also mentioned, the WEI as well as PDF carried out needs assessments of sexual and reproductive health and rights and gender-based violence and access to essential services for people with disabilities. And these were focus groups done in Fiji, Samoa, and Vanuatu. And they identified that there are attitudinal barriers, physical barriers, and legal barriers that people with disabilities face. And those are further compounded in humanitarian contexts. And I just want to share a couple of those recommendations that are relevant here today. So the first one is pass comprehensive legislation harmonizing laws with the Convention on the Rights of People with Disability, ensure robust implementation of national policy for persons with disabilities, ensure that women and girls with disabilities and disabled people's organizations are meaningfully consulted in decision-making processes that affect their lives and their rights, and invest in resources to ensure that sexual and reproductive health and gender-based violence services are accessible to people with diverse disabilities, including in rural and remote areas. Require all sexual and reproductive health and rights and gender-based violence programming to be accessible and staffed by people trained on disability inclusion, including values clarifications trainings. And finally, ensure that people with disabilities are included in and considered in the development of any humanitarian emergency plan development, implementation, and monitoring. I was going to share much more information more deeply about the work that UNFPA is doing, but I'll just say a couple of quick points, and then I wanted to highlight some of the things that we heard. It's fundamental to work on sexual and reproductive health policies and programs and ensure that disability inclusion is mainstreamed. So UNFPA has been working over the last year to support governments to develop reproductive, maternal, neonatal, child, and adolescent health policies in Vanuatu, Tonga, and Kiribati that specifically mainstream disability inclusion, and disabled people's organizations participated in those processes. We've also talked today about the importance of data What we don't know, what we don't count, we don't see, and doesn't enter into policies and programs and services. So UNFPA has been working with various governments to ensure the Washington questions on disability are included in census, as well as multiple cluster indicator surveys to use that information to advocate with governments. We're also working with governments to ensure that gender-based violence services are available and also are specifically able to respond to the needs of women and children with disabilities. And we've also been working on the rollout of the MISP training. MISP is the initial minimum initial service package to respond to reproductive health in times of disasters. So we've also been working on that. Last year, we worked with IPPF to develop and roll out guidelines specifically for people with disability. I just want to highlight some of the important things that I heard that came out of the discussion today, just in some reflections back in hearing such rich information and learning from all of the participants today. One key point that I heard was about shifting the power and leaving no one behind. So we know that people with disabilities, and particularly women with disabilities, do know what they need. And we need to ensure that they are at the table and at the center of program development, policies, and funding decisions. They are not passive receivers of support, and they need to be able to access funds rapidly and respond to their own needs. I also heard about putting systems in place for people with disability during natural disasters, the need for safe, friendly environments, and to advocate on the needs of people with disabilities in climate change, policy development and program development, to ensure that they have a seat at the table, and also to ensure the coordination among all humanitarian actors includes people with disability, the organizations that represent people with disability. And finally, just to come back to a few points about the obligations of the state, the importance of the two-track system. So it's important to mainstream disability, but also to have a targeted approach. And this is also something we talk about in the field of gender mainstreaming as well. So doing specific programming for women, but also mainstreaming gender equality and broader programs as well. And we also talked about building back better. So this is part of climate change. We need to continue to adapt and grow and learn, and ensure that people with disabilities are part of that building back better, and ensuring services and education and protection systems are fully inclusive. And the last point was just the importance, I want to reiterate one more time, about the funding needed for organizations of people with disabilities, and especially women with disabilities. I was particularly disheartened to hear that funding for organizations of people with disabilities is decreasing. And so that's something for the United Nations, as well as a reflection for the government of Australia, who's here with us today, something very important for us to take on board as well, and to do our work in the global advocacy to ensure that there is funding available for organizations representing people with disabilities. So I just want to say thank you very much. This has been a wonderful conversation today, and on behalf of UNFPA, we really thank you for the invitation and for allowing us to participate and learn. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Kathy, for joining us today and for your support as co-sponsor of this event and beyond, in particular for our joint work in the Transformative Agenda program. We have run out of time, so I would like to take only 1 minute to thank, to express our gratitude on behalf of Women Enabled International and the Disability Rights Fund to our speakers, Ambassador Clark, Nelly Taleb, Anna Pella Talakai, and Naomi Tai, and of course, Kathy Taylor for the closing remarks. I think this has been a wonderful conversation, and we have raised really important issues. And my invitation for you all would be to be in touch with organizations of people with disabilities and keep thinking about all these issues in order to ensure that climate change and the work around climate change and natural disasters is fully inclusive of persons with disabilities. I think that's all, unless my colleagues from DRF wanted to share some final comments.
This is Jen from DRF. We're just so grateful to have been a part of this with you. So thanks to everyone for coming, and hopefully we'll continue the conversation.
Please, let's continue the conversation, and thank you, Yesha and Suzanne, for being with us today for the sign language interpretation. And thank you all for participating.
Very much. Thank you, Sophia.
Thank you. Thank you.
Bye-bye.
Thank you, Sophia.
Thank you.
Thank you. Bye-bye.